Okay, so here's a piece that was, I'm titling this piece Digger, and you can see why. To me, he looks like a little trash monger. But this was a piece that it was started during the month of Dragonary, 2022. That's where the sketch came from, and I really liked the way this little guy turned out at that point, and I wanted to take this further and bring this into a finished painting. I also, I've been exploring different techniques in the preliminary work, especially in the underpainting phase, and what I can do digitally with an underpainting and still produce what is a finished oil painting at the end with that process. Now, this was one of my Dragons in Nature pieces that actually has some man-made objects in it. Most of the pieces that I've done to this point are very organic subject matter, trees and, that kind of thing. Just, nothing man-made. I've purposely stayed away from that up until this point. But this guy, I just felt that kind of stuff was so appropriate that I definitely wanted to sort of break the rules this time. Now, one of the first things that I do here, and I just want to mention this before I get into this too much, is just a glaze of yellow over the drawing there. And that right away gave me a good idea of where I was heading with this guy. And before I get into even discussing that further, I want to talk about some of the background prep for this job. Now, I photographed some trash, a beer bottle, a milk container, some newspaper balled up, and a few different things like that. And I lit and shot several still life compositions with those elements. Now, even after attaining those photographs, I wasn't exactly, 100% happy with the photographs. So I took those into Photoshop and moved them around so that I could create the composition that I needed with the elements that I had, and in this case, it's the bottle cap on the milk container and the spiral area on the beer bottle. Now, at that point, I took scanned in the drawing that I had from Dragonary, plopped him into the composition, and plopped, by the way, that's a very technical term in the artistic world. But I placed him into the composition and was able to play around with the shadows behind him and that kind of thing, and get basically everything worked out the way I liked it. I wasn't overly concerned with things like you'll see that you can tell that I just lassoed out the drawing of the dragon, and there's a slight little white outline around it that still looks a little cut out. I wasn't worried about that kind of stuff because, my intention with this is just to use it as an underpainting. Once I create the composition, I tint it gray, or not gray, but brown, and then print it out and it serves as the underpainting, just as a monochromatic oil painting would do in burnt umber or burnt sienna and those kind of things. Those are the colors that I normally use for underpaintings. So that's sort of how I arrived at my starting place for this guy. And I should also mention too that some of the background elements had been through a program, Painter and Photoshop, that allow me to blur areas and add painted brushstrokes even in the digital world. So especially the area up in the upper left-hand corner, is what I'm specifically speaking about. It's an area that I worked on sort of the edges and kind of it's sort of an abstract brushstroke area of the painting that supports the other elements. In the photographs, it was just too tight, too photographic. There were, things on the crumpled newspaper that I could see the text, the headlines, and I wasn't interested in getting into all that, at least not for this piece. That had no relevance with this little guy. And you can even see a little bit of it around the label on the neck of the beer bottle there. There's some type that as I proceed with the lay-in, I'll just obliterate that information. Really what this is, it's in place of an oil painted underpainting. I printed this out on archival paper in sepia tones and then used it as my underpainting. And I'll talk about it a little more, but I really did enjoy this process. I think it was an interesting way to work with these elements, especially elements that I could get a hold of. A lot of times painting fantasy subjects, I don't have such readily available elements just to photograph and work from, and I'm combining elements from photo reference or even imagined drawings and things. Parts are just being created. So to talk about, so this stage of the game here, the first objective is to try and cover, quote, the white space or the underpainting. So I'm my primary goal initially is just to get the thing covered in paint so that I'm no longer looking at, any of the reference of the underpainting or any of that kind of stuff. And then I can really see the weight and, the value relationship between different elements, and I can go from there. And you can see as I lay things in, especially around the neck of the bottle, that there are certain edges where I will employ a color behind it to help certain areas pull forward, certain areas go back. So those kind of decisions are being made as I'm going through this. Some have been made, at least the value choices have been made in Photoshop, but everything is subject to change. So now here is one of the things I spoke about a little bit ago, which is, there's just too much information working this way in some of the underpainting. So I'm just going to, simply blow it out. I'm, just going to get rid of it. It's nothing I would ever spend the time painting. This kind of thing. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you leave to the photorealists who want to be blind as bats by the time they're 30 years old. It's just not for me. I'm really going for more of a painted, almost plein air look to these smaller pieces. So I'm trying to, while I do want the piece to have a pretty high level of realism, it's not a super rendered realism that I'm looking for. One of the things that I did know that I wanted to do, though, being as this guy was yellow, I knew that the background would be affected by a lot of cooler tones, more in shadow or like a half light, and you can see a lot of the bluer highlights in this, and I think that helps pop that yellow forward quite a bit. So I mean, that was a real conscious choice to go with those colors. Even some of the highlights on the glass, you can see, the brown glass, you can see how they're done in like blues and blue grays. And as I work around the neck of this bottle, you can see what I was talking about earlier. I'm kind of laying in colors that I have on the palette, some of the yellow and some of the other things that I just want to have occur in the piece. It's not really about what I'm painting specifically as far as the object. It's more this kind of brushy, textured thing in the background. It's more about the brush handling than the rendering of an object. And I think that, it's one of the things that in laying all of the environment in that I want to keep in mind. Every little thing doesn't have to be rendered. Some of it is just simply support for the more rendered areas in the piece. So now this bottle cap, this was on the milk jug. This was something that I kind of in my head fought with a little bit. I wasn't sure where I was going to go with color with this. This thing could have been almost any color. A real red cap with the yellow dragon would have really driven me down sort of a primary lane with the palette, and I didn't want to go quite that primary. I knew I was still going to want to influence this red by the blue that I was talking about before, the half light and the blue sort of top light that you see that I'm working into it now. And it worked out pretty well here. I like this sort of red violet that I wound up with, and I think that it has that realistic feel that I was going for, still fairly chromatic. And again, you know, the final finish or look that I'm going for with this is a very painted brushstroke, you know, very, very visible brushstroke, plein air sort of look. I keep referring to it as a plein air look, but to me, the guys who do that are usually, you know, painting these things in a few hours as opposed to a week or something like that with more real tight traditional illustration. And it's just something it always looks very masterful when it's done properly. And it's, I think it's worthy of study, and it's definitely something that I want to employ more in my work. So now at this point, I think I have most of the background laid in at this point, and it is probably dry. That was probably the first sitting. So now I'm getting into over the glazes of the sketch of the dragon. I can start to kind of peck in here and play around and see what I think I can get away with some of the other colorations. I did indicate sort of a black beak in the Dragonary study, which was something that I had done that study in pencil and did a little more of a demo, taking it a little bit further in Photoshop, where I did add some darker values, and the dark beak and the little horns and the tips of the wings, really having them stand out in the dark tones, I just thought was really effective. So that was definitely something I was going to go with here. Gives him a little, I don't know what it is, but he just has an ornery little look about him, and I don't know if that's so much the color or if it's the eye. Maybe you guys have a suggestion about, you know, what's causing that look. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So again, I start to just work my way around. I'm still working out some of the imperfections in the underpainting at this point, and you can see that most of that outline that I was talking about a little while ago is pretty much completely obliterated at this point. And if, you know, it hadn't been by now, this would be the stage that I would get rid of that at least with dealing with the dragon himself. This isn't really, I'm not really going for finish with this pass on the dragon, but this is kind of what I consider to be the first real lay-in in oil and getting past just glazing over the underpainting. The one thing that I've noticed over the years working with the yellow palettes, and there's a few other colors that just in the real world seem to, you really want to be respectful of the high key parts of the palette, because it's more difficult to take that real bright yellow and make it opaque again over something darker. I hope I'm explaining this clearly. But so I'm trying to kind of work. I've glazed over the yellow, which has given me basically all of the highlights of the yellow. So now what I'm doing is I'm going in and adding in a lot of the darks, even though I do have a color on the palette that is basically that yellow that's there. So, I mean, I'm adding to that also, which is, again, it's starting to obliterate the drawing underneath and giving me the opacity in paint texture that I'm looking for in the final piece. But If I were to lay this in, say, in that middle kind of orangey color that's there, it would be more difficult. It would take me more passes to get the bright yellow built back up again. So, yellows like that. White can be like that also at times. It's, there's a few colors, and it just has to do with the saturation and the opacity of the pigment itself. Now, again, if you were doing something like this digitally, none of those problems would exist. You could go as pure bright yellow over the blackest black in one brush stroke, and it would be, absolute. That's one of the advantages of digital, but, obviously you're not going to wind up with the painting. So you have to make those choices along the way. Now you can see here too that, while I have some fairly good form lines established in the drawing itself, in the pencil drawing that was scanned in, I'm still going to really bring this thing a lot further. The pencil drawing is still just a few values, and it's more linear indications than it is real mass and value indications of form. So here you can see that even though the guy's yellow, we're going under in that mouth area. It goes pretty dark, burnt umber and some violet or something like that to make a dark. So it's also a matter of trying to take the form that I've created this far and take that even further and really, really push it. Now, again, at this point, I'm not totally worried about, I'm pretty sure I'm going to go over this again. That's almost always my working method. So at this stage, for me, it's about trying to see how the different pigments work, how the paints work, all that kind of stuff. Even though, I have a pretty good idea at this point, but every painting, there's a newness about that every time, even after doing this for 30 years. Every piece is unique. So here, I'm really worried about the form, some slight indications of texture, but I'm really not getting focused on scales or anything like that at this point. I want to have a big muscle on the neck there and, the big pouch on the cheek and that kind of stuff. Those are the things I'm looking for right now, not getting all of the scales laid in or any kind of pattern like that. That's almost too much. I've always had the horse in front of the cart at that point. The scales are always easier to add, at least for me. They're always easier to add if the form looks right. Then they seem to lay over more easily. If you're struggling with the basic form of the thing, then the scales are going to be, you're just, it turns into how many wrongs does it take to make a right. And, sometimes that answers more than you want to admit to. So, this is a stage that it's worth it to make sure you're happy with this before you move on to pecking around in the scales and some of the like tertiary detail really, that exists on this thing. The other thing that I'm trying to be aware of as I'm laying this in, obviously, is its relationship to the background. And by that I mean, am I seeing what I want to see? Do the horns and the little dark areas, do they help him pop forward? Do they help him sit in this background? In some cases, you want edges to disappear. In some cases, you want them to pop forward. There's opportunities for color to be exciting and pop against more complementary colors. And in this, they're not really complementary. It's the yellow and the blue, but it's a cool and a warm, so they have some zip to them. So those are all things that I'm keeping in mind as I'm working these edges and working this guy literally working him into the painting. one thing that was pretty sure at this point that I wanted to go with was a sort of a different kind of a scale, more of a small little, like a gecko hide almost, than like a chain, this sort of plate mail scaling that's common on dragons, and I do it a lot myself. But since this guy was a little smaller, I just wanted to play around with something a little different than that. And you'll see where that goes here in a little while. But as I work around, the top and around this cheek and all that kind of stuff, I'm just kind of pecking away these little spots. It is starting to indicate a texture here and there. But to me, I'm still thinking about the form at this point. I'm really not overly concerned with the texture. It just happens to be sort of the way I work. And at this point, I'm usually trying to help myself set up the next shot, so to speak. So I'm starting to indicate a little texture, even though that's not really what I'm doing here. And now, the little area, the little horn on his back there, and that little negative space under the wing is an area that makes a lot more sense now. It didn't really in the underpainting. It was all kind of mushed together. It was hard to tell whether it was a negative space, whether it was the other wing you're seeing on the other side. And so again, as I'm noodling around with this is really the time to get in here and resolve those issues. These are real small compositional things. Overall, the whole piece has already been, pretty well defined. But it's the same kind of thing. I'm working around keeping the musculature, the roundness, the form of those things in my mind. Again, I tend to work a little slower with something like a yellow because I don't want to obliterate the real high key yellow tones that are in there, which are easy to do. And as always, I'm flipping this thing all over the place all the time on its side, so even upside down, whatever that takes. Sometimes it's brush direction that drives those. It's the decision to do that, and sometimes it's just to get a different look at it, just so that you can see, hey, the light looks good. It looks, to me, the light's coming from the top in this piece, but sat on its side like this now, it looks like the light's coming from the right, and it just kind of it gives my mind sort of a little restart. Some new rules to follow and reassess everything and make sure that things are going as planned. So now at this point, I'm in the wings, and I knew the tips of the wings and the toenails, the claws on the feet, as well as the stripe of horns going down his head, were all going to have a dark accent to them. They were going to be dark and then have a little bit of like a burnt sienna or something to gradate into that yellow. But again, here I'm just starting to work in more of the anatomy of these two wings to separate the wing from the one behind it. You can see the spines that exist in the wings, and then the little fingers at the end that will have these darker spikes. So at this point, I'd say that the lay-in on the top of the wings and the head is looking pretty good, and it's just a matter of moving this down and basically getting this whole character laid in like this. And as I start to work the dark colors, I move back to the horns on the top, and that's just to make sure that everything is being treated the same. All of those little dark areas should look like they are made of the same texture and have a lot of the same colors and values represented in them, so that they appear to be the same stuff. And again, here on the backs of these wings, this is really where we get I mean, we just blow out the rest of the underpainting completely, and we really move this thing into, being a pass away from being done after this. Now, what a lot of times my reasoning for stopping at this point, rather than fighting the good fight and trying to take these things all the way to finish at this sitting, is that I prefer to get to a point that I feel relatively comfortable with the piece and then let it dry. And it's just a safety. If I start to try new things that I don't like about it the next day, I can wipe back to this. So for me, it's just a technique that I've developed over the years. But you could push forward if you were so inclined. Now the can here is something that's interesting, because this is basically, just some photography. I mean, it's the reference that I shot of my trash, and I now have a palette pretty much developed because of the top half of the painting, because of the milk jug area, which is saying that everything is in this sort of blue reflected skylight color. And again, you can see where, I'm trying to be very faithful to the values of the reference, but there's too much information in this photography. I mean, I'm not interested in trying to paint, the what state the the 5-cent deposits from. All that doesn't matter. That has no bearing on this piece at all, and I'm not interested in trying to, spend a week duplicating that photograph. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go over this thing, blow out the information that I don't want in the photograph, and in that process, hopefully wind up with what is a painterly representation of that can. And it would look pretty much this way if I, this time I worked over this type of an underpainting, what I call the digital underpainting. But, even if I were not to do that and I were to do this old school, the can would still, the finished product would still pretty much look exactly like this, whether the process was to work over the photography like this, or whether it was to take this comp, put it in a projector, project it onto a whiteboard, get all the outlines, and then build up the value and underpaintings using burnt umber and sienna and those kind of things. So again, I think that it's hard to deny that at this point that the face of that can looks very painted. It's hard to tell there was ever a photograph underneath it, so to speak. So to me, this is a real, it's a real time saver when this kind of stuff is available. And by being available, I mean that in fantasy, just sometimes you just are not going to get reference that's this perfect for what you need. It's a little bit of an advantage working on these for me as fine art pieces, because I can do what I want. I'm not at the mercy of an art director or any client. Not beholden to them to change, what is or what isn't in this. So, I mean, a client, for example, may have wanted this guy standing on the top of a volcano or something like that, and something I just wasn't going to be able to photograph myself in this way. And here's an example of, when you can get the reference. It's I think it's a great technique. Now here, just right side up again, we're back to the back of the wings and the little tips and things like that. And the plan here is to kind of detail this guy now. I mean, obviously I have the second half of him to lay in, and we'll go through some things. This was something here. I knew I had a few issues with the drawing of the front hands. So that was something I knew I was going to get involved with again when I got into it in paint. And I have several dinosaur, not several, I mean, I have a bunch of little dinosaur toys and models and stuff around the studio, and I'm constantly looking at them too, just to try and get the anatomy to feel natural on these dragons. The way the legs bend, or the knees, or the claws might have 3 fingers, 4 fingers, whatever they have. You can. I mean, there's no right or wrong way to do this. These things are just guides, but I prefer to ground it in some reality. I think it gives it a little more sense of being believable. Now, again, as I'm working on the bottom part of this, I've got at least a theory now working about how this guy is coming together. The nails are going to be black around the edges, the fingernails, the toenails, and stuff like that. And I have the yellow palette pretty resolved, and I'm also pretty familiar at this point with how the yellow is working together, meaning that how saturated the highlight of the yellow is compared to some of the other paint and that kind of thing. So that's really just the tactile mechanics of it. And that's oil paint. That's just something you sort of have to get used to in order to know what you're doing. So here we go. And this is the same kind of approach with these toes as the tips of the wings. I'm really getting in here now and refining the drawing a little bit more, getting the nails drawn in. Some of the underpainting had been obliterated with the lay-in of the cans and that kind of thing. So, it's a time to kind of sharpen that up. Now, I do know that at this point, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to lay in these feet, and then I'm going to see what that all looks like and how well that marries up to the can, because that's really where the drawn dragon touches the realistic elements in this thing, or the elements that I have referenced for the real elements. So I need to create shadows, and there are certain things around that have to work. So I just keep that stuff in mind as I'm moving through this. Now, I moved on from the hands at this point, even though the hands are a long way from being done. But I did just block them in. I want to just point this out, that I blocked them in and let them dry like that. So I moved on to the leg and some other areas, the tail and under the wing. And even though the hands still look a little rough, my intention is to get back to them, but I'll get back to them over that dried painting that's there now. So that'll give me a little more of a jumping off point. Flip it on its side. That's they'll put that on my tombstone probably. Maybe they'll flip me on my side. I don't know. But anyway, so here we go now. Underneath the tail was a good example there. The edge almost completely disappeared until I put that dark in. So it was not anything that was, visually disruptive. I just needed it to stand out a little more. So I was able to do that by just plopping that dark in. And there's one of my little dinosaur models makes an appearance. And I even had fastened a little real quick lump of clay on, you may have noticed there, as a wing. And all that was doing was showing me how that shadow fell on the wing. It was just, I was after one very specific piece of information, even though it wasn't exactly what I was, wasn't this dragon exactly. It was enough to give me the information that I needed. So at this point, I'd consider that dragon as having its first pass done. The underpainting is completely painted out and everything is there. So now the next phase over that would be to get in and really detail the dragon and detail it to finish. But before I do that, it's nice to be able to get in around the can and pop in some of those higher highlights. Because at this point the composition is really coming together, and I basically want to work the I'm trying to take the background to finish first, leaving the detail in the dragon for the final touches. That way, if I want to redraw an edge or the hands or the profile of it or whatever, I can. But the background is essentially done. So, and that's what we have here. And again, I want to point out that the Coke can, or they're not. It's not really Coke. It's some other brand. And that was something I purposely steered away from, was any kind of recognizable branding on the soda cans or beer bottles. But I wanted to keep that stuff loose, so that, and also by comparison, the little scale details on the dragon will look tighter. Everything is relative in this, and if I were to render the Coke cans and the bottles just to where they were like photographic, just rendered out to the hilt, there wouldn't be very far to go, to create focus on the main element, which is the dragon. So, in a way, in my mind, while I'm working on this thing, I've already worked it backwards in my mind. So it's, now I'm kind of backing into finish on the details. And again, I remember thinking these hands looked a little clunky, so I knew they were going to need a little more work than what they had there, as well as the feet. But it was coming along nicely at this point, and it was really just a matter of noodling the details until I got to something that I was happy with. And again, the feet here, how they interact with the can is pretty important, because that's really where the fantasy meets the reality of this, and hopefully it all looks seamless in the end. So it's a lot of back and forth, whether the toenails are in front of the edge of the can, whether they're behind that lip of the can, this or that. It's always interesting to me. The things that you spend the most time on in the painting are, they seem to be the things that nobody ever notices, and you may not want them to notice it, but there's an irony in that. The things that impress people the most are generally the things that happen the easiest. I do think that the texture of the skin, that was I was pretty happy with the way that turned out on this. It does feel a little different from, like one of my standard sort of D&D type dragons. It has just a little bit more of an interesting quality and texture, a little more variation to it, which is really something I plan to explore even more and more as the Dragons of Nature series progresses. And at this point, I'm really just looking around, trying to see what else needs to finish. What else to take. It's coming together, and we're really in the final stages of it. The palette also, I should say that, like, the the underbelly area is the same palette as the Coke cans. I keep calling them Coke cans. It's sparkling water cans, but at this point you have your whole palette of color, that what's in it. So when you're looking for things, I just need a little color here or there. A lot of times it can already be found on your palette rather than introducing a new color. Now I did introduce two primary colors here, which was the primary thing that I had mentioned earlier in this video, the yellow and red, and it only lacked the blue, which was already kind of in here in the shadow form. I started to play with just putting something in. Again, I wanted to stay away from logos or anything real recognizable there. And you'll even see that while I did like what was going on here, it became a little too chromatic, and it was sort of fighting what was going on with the dragon. So I wiped some of it out, and that even looked better. I mean, it looked, not quite as, it wasn't quite as distracting. So then I was just able to go back in and sharpen a few things, add that red throughout the piece here and there, more as an arbitrary accent, less as, an actual rendering an object that was that color. So it's really just an arbitrary color of red that pokes through it. And I put a little bit up there that you can see over the other side of his beak. And it just makes the piece, it makes the that red feel like it belongs in the piece. And that's what this whole thing is now. I'm just poking around a couple little things, finish here and there, reflections in the glass, and we're getting real close to being done with this little guy. It seems like, I just always feel like I'm always forever cleaning up little knick-knacky things in these paintings, but, that almost seems unavoidable to me. I know some people don't have that issue as much, but, the more I work sometimes, the more I see that I want to change. I have to be careful about that, or I would have my whole career on one piece of Masonite. I would just be continually repainting it over and over again. So yeah, a lot of these little pings, highlights, again, it gives a real air of finish and detail to a lot of the little elements that were just sort of darks. Some of that little bit that I'm doing around the beak, it's subtle, but it's just introducing some values that help that beak pop forward just a bit, though. The beak and the tips of the backs of the wings, they kind of blend in with the environment a little bit, which I think helps sit him into this environment, frankly. So. And there we go. That's the journey. I really enjoyed this little guy. I hope you did too. And if you have any questions, comments, I'd love to hear from you guys. Feel free to post them in the comments, and we'll see you next time.